All right, well, thank you everyone for joining. Good afternoon. My name is Bea Spiller and I'm a lead senior economist at Environmental Defense Fund, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar. Today's conversation is the fourth in a series of webinars organized by Environmental Defense Fund and Policy Integrity with the generous support of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Environmental Defense Fund is a nonprofit environmental organization that uses science and economics to find practical and lasting solutions to some of the world's most pressing environmental problems. Institute for Policy Integrity is a nonpartisan academic think tank dedicated to improving the quality of governmental decision-making and who uses economics and law to support smart policies for the environment, public health, and consumers. Given our organizational goals, Bertrand Unel at IPI and I have been hosting a series of webinars highlighting the ongoing energy research funded by the Sloan Foundation. Now, our goal in these conversations is to bridge the gap between academic research and real-life policymakers. So with that in mind, each of these webinars invites academic researchers funded by the Sloan Foundation, as well as policy experts who work on these topics on a daily basis. These conversations are aimed at simultaneously helping inform policymakers with the latest insights from cutting-edge research and results in better policies, while also helping researchers identify open policy questions and better understand how they can focus their research for a higher policy impact. Now, within this backdrop, we will be discussing a topic today that is very near and dear to my heart, and is also something that is very important as we move towards a cleaner, more distributed grid. As more households adopt distributed energy resources, or DERs, such as rooftop solar and electric vehicles, the local distribution grid will need to adapt. Now, though these technologies can help clean up our environment, the electric system will need to expand accordingly, both at the local level and at the system level. There are ways, however, in which we can keep these costs down, and other DERs, including demand response, energy efficiency, and batteries, will be key to ensuring our grid is able to accommodate these technologies. The webinar today will discuss how we can leverage data to identify these potential impacts on the distribution grid, as well as take action to reduce costs that greater DER adoption may bring. They will also talk about how academic research can contribute to policymaking in the space, as well as how policy discussions can encourage new research on this topic. So without further ado, I would like to turn the microphone over to my esteemed colleague, Elizabeth Stein, who will be moderating today's discussion. Elizabeth is the lead counsel for energy transition at EDF. She engages in state proceedings to advocate for aligning energy policies with state climate policies, with a particular focus on reducing reliance on oil and gas in the transportation and building sectors. Elizabeth has been at the forefront of the legal and legislative challenges toward creating a clean energy economy for about 12 years now, working to make New York's electric system more resilient and pushing for electrical grid upgrades to allow for more electric vehicles on the road. So Elizabeth, over to you.
Thanks so much, Bea, for giving me the opportunity to moderate this exciting discussion and for that introduction. And thanks also to Dr. Bertrand Unel of Policy Integrity. I'm going to give a brief introduction for each of our speakers and then pass the mic to them for their presentations. After those presentations, we're going to have about half an hour of moderated Q&A, and then we'll switch over to questions supplied by the audience members. So please feel free to start using the Q&A function during the presentations if questions strike you at that time or at any other time. Our first presenter will be Dr. Anamika Dubey. Anamika is an assistant professor of electrical engineering and computer science at Washington State University. She's currently conducting a multidisciplinary research project that examines the impact of demand response programs on distribution systems. Her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Today, Anamika will be presenting on research around designing incentives to increase sustained demand-side participation to provide grid services for peak reduction. After Anamika, our next presenter will be Dr. Alan Jen. Alan is an assistant professional researcher at the Plug-in Hybrid and Electric Vehicle Group of the Institute of Transportation Studies at the University of California at Davis, as well as an affiliate at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. He investigates how future electric vehicle demand will impact the development of electricity distribution infrastructure and has collaborated with the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency on analyzing electric vehicle policies. Alan will be presenting research that examines distribution grid impacts of electric vehicles with California as a case study. After Alan, the next presenter will be Dr. Jim Bushnell. Jim is a professor of economics at the University of California, Davis, and a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. He is currently researching ways to quantify existing and pending distribution system impacts of high penetration levels of distributed energy resources and loads. Since 2002, he's served on the Market Surveillance Committee of the California Independent System Operator. And today his remarks will focus on the impacts of distributed energy resources on distribution systems and the critical question of whether they can or do reduce costs or just shift costs, as well as the rate making and policy implications of this question. And finally, we'll hear from Michelle Rozier, the Economic Analysis Supervisor from the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. Michelle previously served as a distributed energy resource specialist focusing on interconnection standards, process agreements, and technical requirements, as well as grid modernization, integrated distribution planning, host capacity analysis, tariff and rate design, dispute resolution, and stakeholder engagement. Today, Michelle will wind up the initial presentations by discussing how a utility regulator considers distributed energy and distribution network impacts, such as those examined by the other presenters, and how that informs their decision-making. So thank you all so much for being here today to share your research and your perspectives. And Anamika, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you, Elizabeth, for a kind introduction. I'll share my screen. Can you all see it? Awesome. Okay. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the introduction. My discussion and my talk is going to be about incentivizing residential demand-side participation and some of the research that we have been doing in this domain. This is a collaborative work with the School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, that is me, and School of Economic Sciences with Professor Alan Love and Oliver Bergland. Our goal, this project is funded by Sloan P. Foundation. What I'm going to talk today is basically what problem we have been studying and what conclusions we draw based on our study of the demand side participation, specifically for the residential customer. So before I start, the first thing is, what's the motivation for this problem? So we know that our electric power grid is going through unprecedented challenges. There is uncertain demand supply imbalances. We are seeing very large penetration of renewable and variable energy resources. We are also seeing new types of load, for example, plug-in electric vehicles, which are significantly going to increase the load demand from the system. All of this transition needs to happen while making sure that we are not emitting a lot of carbon, and while we are making sure that we are doing this transition for the electric power grid in a sustainable manner. This means simultaneously the electric power grid is also essentially impacted by extreme weather events, which are happening at a more rapid frequency. For example, we are seeing often extreme heat and extreme cold events going on, which basically creates again this uncertain demand supply imbalances that needs a management solution. So essentially what we require to meet our goal of transitioning to a clean and green energy future, we need added resources of flexibility in our power grid to make the supply demand imbalances balance out in a real-time sense. And one such solution is to use demand response resources, and that's the focus of this project. We specifically focused on the residential demand side flexibility. The goal was to look into what are the why the residential demand side flexibility remains still untapped, and how it can be enabled with the help of understanding the electricity consumption data from the consumers, as well as simultaneously figuring out how that flexibility can be leveraged more proactively towards grid services. So we noticed that residential demand side flexibility remains mostly untapped, although there have been several efforts made due to grid automation and then making it possible for us to interact with the residential side resources. Still, there are significant number of residential customers who are not participating in these demand response program. There are also these challenges to customer drop-offs, and no response, which is prohibiting us realizing the full potential of the demand-side resources. So in this research, we basically proposed that how can we increase the demand-side participation by designing these incentives, which are informed by the consumer behavior and preferences for electricity users, to specifically provide grid services such as peak load reduction. The methods that we have developed could be applied for different kinds of grid services as well. For example, more localized balancing of the supply and demand to meet this, grid flexibility requirement at a more local level. Basically, this is the outline of our proposed research. Our goal is to focused on sustainable, effective household demand response participation. And the key idea was to look into how to make household consumer, enable them to make financially risk-free decision, where they accept a payment from the power authority in return of being subjected to a disutility associated with the discomfort that would cause because of the enactment of the demand response program. So the question that we asked when we wanted to enable this kind of setup, the question we asked is that how likely is there a specific consumer is willing to change their energy consumption in response to a change in electricity prices. So we want to figure out what is this likely, what price will incentivize this likely change in the consumer behavior. And then we wanted to figure out how to incorporate that systematically in our demand response program. So very briefly, what we did, these two questions is how we answered it. The first question was how likely the specific consumer is to change their electricity consumption. For this particular question, we took the use of real world data, including smart meter data, time of day, meteorological data, electricity rates, and all this thing to understand how consumer really consumes its electricity, specifically the loads that we can control. For example, a HVAC load or a smart water heater load. And based on that, we essentially tried to figure out how to design those contracts which look more attractive to these consumers, because if we are already taking care of what is their disutility for not using the electricity at the time when they want to use it. So this research basically involved, analyzing a lot of smart meter data to understand the consumer electricity users pattern. And then based on that, we proposed critical peak rebate contracts, which essentially are contracts between the electricity authority and the consumer, where consumers are paid in response to kind of selling their utility to the for the use of electricity loads, not when they really want to use it. So the main goal was to design these optimal contracts, which are informed by the consumers' users for the electricity. That we did from the answering the first question. And the second question was to design these financially risk-free contracts, which basically enable consumer to remain in the demand response program, because these contracts are trying to maximize both the electric authority's objective as well as the objectives of the consumer itself. And within this contract design process, we also evaluated the how these contracts can help within the hierarchical structured retail market, as well as the transmission or wholesale level market as well. That is shown kind of in the figure next. So since it's a brief presentation, I just want to summarize what we did. The final conclusion was that our goal was to design these optimal contracts, which provide this, financial risk reduction. That our hope is that it will lead to increased consumer retention and demand response program, because we are effectively modeling the consumer's electricity behavior and patterns, and then using it to design these rates or the critical peak rebates, which are informed by these consumer, energy consumption pattern. These contracts, if they are realized, and we can actually leverage new values, we can create a new value stream for the flexible load at the residential scale, which can help with the peak load management, provide more flexibility from the power grid, and lead to more efficient and economical grid. And finally, we hope that this kind of programs can also help reduce price volatility from the renewable energy resources by providing this real-time wholesale, by reducing the real-time wholesale market uncertainty, and encourage further adoption of renewables such as solar and wind. So I'll pause at this point and back to the next speaker.
Great. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And if the host could allow me to also share my video. It's disabled. Great. All right, hello everyone. My name is Alan Jen, and I'll be discussing a topic about distribution grid impacts of electric vehicles. And before I start, I'd like everyone to think about what comes to your mind when you think about smart charging for electric vehicles. And if you picture that for a moment, I think most people kind of gravitate towards this idea that, hey, maybe we can integrate better with the grid. What does that mean? Maybe helping to deal with the intermittency of renewables, buying electricity when it's low, charging your vehicle, and then if you have a V2G scheme, maybe you're discharging it when the electricity prices are higher. But in reality, I think from what we've been finding is that avoiding the costs associated with infrastructure deployment is where you're really going to save a lot of money. And so this is kind of the impetus behind this particular research project, which I'll mention is actually a completed Sloan project. We've actually already published this work. It's under the same name as the title of this presentation if folks are interested in reading about this. And what we did in this project was to have a high resolution examination of distribution networks in California's PG&E territory. So we employ data from the integration capacity analysis maps. This is a sort of sample of what the networks look like in the Bay Area. I pulled out a specific map for those who are familiar with the Davis, city of Davis. There's about a dozen or so feeders among a population between, I would say, 60 to 80,000 people. And so we are looking at the sort of level of resolution below the substation. And essentially what we were able to do was to project basically when different levels of electric vehicle adoption would essentially exceed the threshold capabilities of existing infrastructure in the ground. So there's a whole bunch of background going into drawing these lines that I won't get into. But the basic idea is that unlike thinking about integration of electric vehicles at the sort of wholesale generation level, at the distribution infrastructure level, unfortunately, it's not very easy to generalize the sort of impacts and the response that would be required to help mitigate these. There's a huge diversity of load shapes, a diversity of how close existing infrastructure already is to some of the capacity thresholds, and then differences between the way people charge vehicles in different areas and where we expect electric vehicles to be adopted. And so this is a very difficult problem because it makes the application of policy to address this sort of very heterogeneous across the service territory in PG&E. Nevertheless, infrastructure upgrades are going to be critical. We found that once you're getting to, let's say, the governor's target of 5 million electric vehicles by 2030, over a fifth of the distribution feeder networks are going to start exceeding their rated capacities. It's not like utilities are sitting around twiddling their thumbs here. They've actually done a lot of work to try and understand where some of these upgrades are going to be needed. Unfortunately, we actually dove into some of their analysis. This is known as the grid needs assessment, and so these upgrades that they're projecting had a huge mismatch with some of the work that we were analyzing, and so I think there's an important need to hone in on this on sort of better modeling and the specific need requirements for infrastructure upgrades throughout their territories. So I'll just close out and say, when we think about this integration of electric vehicles with the grid at a holistic level, I think there's a lot of policy mechanisms and discussion about ways to monetize some of the benefits of charging to accommodate the grid. So we think about differences in electricity rates, participation in all sorts of different electricity markets, thinking about using batteries as grid storage. But there really is no incentive mechanisms to think about how we might try and rebate the avoided costs of distribution infrastructure. And I think that those costs, according to some of the analysis that we've been doing here, are going to be by far the most substantial costs to the grid. And so finding a correct pricing signal to kind of deal with these issues is going to be very important. Recently, a lot of money has been pouring into the development of charging infrastructure deployments. Right, we recently had and will potentially have infrastructure bills that are going to be pouring billions of dollars into putting electric vehicle chargers all over the country. And as money is pouring into funding this expansion, I think folks will need to start thinking very carefully about the dedication of some of these funds to the upstream distribution infrastructure grids. Yeah, and I'll go ahead and leave it there. I guess we'll take questions a little bit later, and I'll welcome the next presenter.
Oh, and I'm muted. So, okay, now I can start, and I need to share the, there we go. All right, so this is going to follow on a lot of what you've already heard. The slide here lists the people who are participating in this particular Sloan funded project. I'm going to sort of talk at a very high level and rope in a bunch of things on this general research thrust here. Starting with the policy backdrop, which Bea already kind of covered. I'll do it again quickly. There are these two mega trends. There are some others, but the ones that we're really interested about is all this talk about the utility of the future. There's lots of, I'll call it excitement, let's say, about what and if distributed generation can do and will do, as well as storage and other types of technologies that are sort of penetrating at the distribution level. And all of this excitement is playing out against a backdrop of debates over who should actually pay for the distribution grid. And I guess in California, it's maybe better to characterize it as who should not pay for the grid. And those sorts of debates are really bumping up against claims that really need more research to establish what the costs and benefits to particularly the distribution grid actually historically have been and could be going forward. Lots of pieces need to fall into place for policymakers to be able to really answer that in an informed way. And this research and really the others is sort of pushing in that direction. The other half of this is on the load side. You could think of the DG as the supply side. And that's the fact that climate policy is really banking on this massive electrification of the transportation, space heating, and water heating, among other things. That, among other things, involves a large expansion of potentially controllable loads. If you think about it, particularly EV charging and water heating, maybe less space heating, are really ideal end use cases for shifting the timing and deferring specific uses of energy. And that makes them, if the technology and the incentives can be put in place, really ideal cases and a lot of potential there. All right, so with all that as backdrop, on this specific project, which is really kind of a data collection kind of project with various strings of analysis coming out of it. We have been expanding over time the collection of individual residential meter data. We've got 5 years now worth of about 10% of the meters in the 3 big California investor-owned utility service territories. It's something like 16 billion hourly electricity use observations. And there's a whole bunch of information in this, including usage, some rate information, billing. And for purposes of this conversation, it also includes every outage event each of these customer experiences, and some rough characterization of the causes of those outages, allowing us to exclude things like, tree falls from other things. We also have access to DMV data under all sorts of different confidentiality agreements that allow us to observe when different types of vehicles are registered at these households, and also solar installation data, a few other things. And really, we've been in the process of trying to navigate these confidentiality arrangements and merge all of these data sources to give a clear picture of exactly what's happening at the residential level. One of the things that maybe we can discuss is that even the utilities themselves do not have as clear a picture about where particularly the electric vehicles are in their own service territories, which is, as Alan was sort of saying, it really is a problem if we want to try to predict where we should be doing distribution level upgrades if there isn't sort of the proper information flow going on. So we've got a lot of cars, a lot of households, and a lot of different stuff, and we're asking a lot of different questions at a very high level. To give you a couple pictures of what we've been doing, one of the things we've been looking at is what is the change in consumption at individual households when an EV is registered. This is an example from one particular utility during a particular time frame. But the idea here is we can observe the hourly loads at these residences. We can see how they change at each individual household before and after a registered EV. An EV is registered at that residence, and we can sort of assign an EV effect to the difference. I think what's notable here, and Alan's picture sort of implied something very similar, is that the bulk of the charging is happening during periods that are off peak. And so in terms of exceeding these thresholds, most of it isn't necessarily adding to that. But there's this little thing up at the top here in hours 19-20 where the worry starts to happen. And so you could kind of think of the glass half full. It takes like 6 billion EVs to actually get over these thresholds, but that's because a lot of that is happening off peak. And maybe there are ways to move that little bit to further off peak to help provide some of that deferral Alan was talking about. As the reliability goes, okay, so first of all, roughly 3 to 4 kilowatt hours per day at residential meters, the bulk of it off peak. By comparison, the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program awards a lot more than that, under an assumption of what's happening at residences. That's an ongoing conversation. With the reliability relationships, we haven't found any significant relationship between cumulative or incremental EV registrations in individual areas and the basic reliability indices like SAIDI, SAIFI, MAFI. We've been doing this at the sort of neighborhood level, census block level. Our next steps are to try to take those same maps Alan was showing you and try to merge our households to those and examine these impacts at the reliability at the circuit level, which would allow us to control for things like the carrying capacity Alan mentioned, as well as investment activity in these circuits and those sorts of things. Because some of our regressions show that EVs improve reliability, and we suspect what's happening there is the utilities are making proactive investments, and to the extent that they are sort of leading the EV penetration, then areas that are going to get EVs, correlations will show that EVs are, correlated with higher reliability because of that investment. We also have an ongoing trial trying to solicit the willingness of individual EV owners to engage in utility managed EV charging programs. There's a lot of excitement about the potential of these things, and this experiment is really meant to try to figure out exactly just how excited the individual EV owners are, and what type of incentives it might take to get them to participate. So just let me end with, even microgrids or grids, we got to pay for them somehow. Maybe we can lower the costs, but the current ways of trying to compensate for both the construction of grids and the deferral of construction are getting pretty outdated. And so we need to know what the cost and benefits of these distributed resources are in order to sort of separate the myths and the arguments from the reality and try to align those incentives with the real benefits they're providing. Thank you.
Thanks, and I believe, Anne, you're going to put my slides up. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Rozier. I'm with the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, and I'm going to be sort of right where Jim ended about the way that we've done things and what we need to do going forward, and talk about that from a state commission perspective. So next slide. I did want to first just say, Anna, can you do the next slide? Thanks. That the ideas in this presentation are mine and they do not represent the views of the commission. Next slide. I'm going to not cover all of the points here, but I do think an important thing to keep in mind is 50 states are 50 state commissions, and commissions are structured differently. So for instance, whether a commission is in a vertically integrated state like Minnesota, where pretty much generation, transmission, and distribution are still regulated by the commission, versus in restructured states where there may be competition in parts of the system. Also, whether the commissioners are appointed or politically elected. And then one thing to keep in mind is state commissions are primarily economic regulators of monopolies, and the industries that we regulate vary. Additional jurisdiction or policy objectives vary by state. So Minnesota has state laws on renewable energy, energy efficiency, distributed generation, and more. And so some of the stuff I'm going to talk about that we do in Minnesota, other states may not be doing because they may not have the same jurisdiction or policy objectives set by the state legislature. Commissions are quasi-judicial and quasi-legislative. That means that decisions are based on a record of information filed in a given docket and relevant statutes, rules, and orders that apply. And the orders are how the commission delivers their decisions, and that's what speaks for the commission. And then while we're focused in this presentation on the distribution system, a lot of discussion is happening around state and federal jurisdiction as we look at some of the changes happening to the grid, and that requires a shared responsibility, collaboration, and coordination. And I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Next slide. Okay, so to start, I'm kind of going up to the forest level here about what state commissions look at generally. So these are 4 primary areas of work that the Minnesota Commission has done for decades. And these navy circles show areas where distribution planning data is starting to show up in plans that it didn't show up in necessarily before. Rate case is maybe a distinction on that. And so I don't have time to address each of these in my 5 minutes, but so I'm going to focus on the resource plans in the upper left, or the blue section. So in Minnesota, resource plans are 15-year look-aheads at the generation needs for a utility. Recently, utilities have moved from a static capacity expansion model known as strategist to a more time and location granular capacity and energy model known as an Encompass. And the model takes assumptions about existing generation, demand side management, generic alternative generation capacity and energy, as well as load forecasts. And through a very robust process, the result is size, type, and timing decisions for the utility in terms of what it needs going forward. In the past 10 years, there's been a concerted move from planning for capacity for historical high peak demand, sometimes known as worst in 10 years, to thinking about resource adequacy from a systems need. So thinking about energy, kilowatt hours over every hour of the day, as well as other attributes like ramping. All right, next slide.
Sorry, one sec.
So most of what you're seeing on this slide fits in just a tiny, oh, there you go. Yep, thanks. The tiny gray and peach boxes on this slide, that last slide fits in here. The rest of this visual is a recommendation that Minnesota considered as it developed what's known as integrated distribution planning. And it recognized that the Minnesota and several other states have started to require this type of planning because they recognized the move from large generation to more variable, intermittent, and distributed generation, as well as the need for utilities to invest in aging distribution infrastructure. And then add to that some of what you heard from Alan and Jim about the increased electrification of transportation, and add then heating that is adding stress to the distribution system. Again, I can't cover everything in this slide, but I'm hoping it demonstrates the myriad of areas where issues of modeling versus real world data comes up for commissions. For instance, the value of DER in the green box is a hot topic, but also one that is difficult to determine and impacted by the area in the blue. And you heard that in some of the earlier presentations. So most of my work at the Commission has been in that blue and purple box around assessing current distribution systems, updating the interconnection standards, and hosting capacity information to inform these plans and the grid modernization investment proposals, because those are the steps necessary to connect distributed energy resources to the utilities grid. So next slide. So lastly, on this next slide, sorry, Anna, we're going to look at hosting capacity and interconnection specifically. And you saw some hosting capacity maps, I believe, on Alan's slides from California. Minnesota, one of our utilities does similar maps, but as you can see here, the information is not as granular. So it's in zones rather than along specific feeders. And what I want to show with this example is that when you have low penetrations of distributed energy resources, the assumptions that you use versus real world data allows projects to interconnect often faster and cheaper. And again, for smaller utilities, putting together a hosting capacity analysis is quite a daunting and expensive task. However, as penetration increases, whether it's in a specific location on the utilities grid or throughout their area, those estimates can result in longer. So using those estimates versus more real world data can result in longer interconnection review timeframes and higher costs. And so Jim was talking about that in terms of the distribution upgrade costs. So the question becomes, at what point is it worth the time and cost to collect and update real world data versus using assumptions? And how useful is that real world data to an ever-changing dynamic distribution system? And that's a question that we grapple with in pretty much every docket related to distributed energy resources and investments that our utilities are making. Add to that the fact that a lot of the tools and software require a lot of investments because that visibility hadn't been needed prior. And so it involves a lot of foundation building to be able to use these new tools, as well as training staff. And then so that software, if it becomes obsolete or is replaced, and we can talk about this in Q&A, but that's just a new thing that utilities and commissions are having to grapple with that we didn't prior. So with that, I guess I'll turn it over for questions.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for terrific presentations. And I'd like to ask all the speakers, please, who I guess most of you have, but not Anamika. Hi, Anamika. Please turn on your cameras, and if you're going to speak, please unmute, although you can mute between. And I'm going to pose a few questions as discussed before, and then we'll start looking more to posing questions that were in the Q&A. But before getting into any sort of deeper policy implication questions, I have more kind of clarifying questions for most of the speakers, or slightly clarifying, if I may. Anamika, you mentioned that the research is motivated by the increasing challenge of matching supply and demand with a higher renewables penetration, et cetera. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the types of flexibility and sort of timeframes for flexibility that are actually needed from residential customers, and the types of behaviors from the residential customers that one would hope these programs would actually motivate, and sort of what kinds of contracts are currently used to achieve those goals that may not be working very well.
Sure. That's actually a big question. Let me try to be concise. So the time scale of flexibility that is needed actually depend upon what kind of grid services we are extracting, and what kind of grid services we are extracting depend upon what time frame of the grid operation we are looking for. So for example, at the residential level, one of the basic grid service that is attractive is peak load curtailment, because that leads to, this is from my understanding, that leads to basically investment into distribution upgrades. And this could be more like a non-wires alternative for that upgrade, where we can just utilize the available flexibility at the residential level to curtail off those peaks, which we see, let's say 100 or 200 hours over the year. So this is what we focused on this particular project. We were looking for demand response, peak demand curtailment from these, peak reduction of the peaks from the help of demand response from the consumers. Now, there are two types of demand response program, of course, which has focused on the incentives, other which are focused on more price-based demand response program. Both are equally active in this in the utility space, as well as in the retail, as well as the wholesale market participation. They have a different nature. The price-based are basically based on the price signals that are coming from the energy authority, and the consumers basically dynamically respond to them, versus the incentive based, which are kind of more based on the incentives for the consumer to either reduce their demand or even dispatch their generation to support the grid services, right? So those are other part of the things. Then we look into the time frame of response. If we look at the bulk grid services, one of the bulk grid services that will be crucially needed is providing ancillary service support. That is really because of these, renewable, which are ramping up and high very fast, and we need to provide balancing services from this consumer. Now, that is much faster scale demand response. That's what FERC 2222 is focusing on, which basically it requires us to provide more aggregated and more firm capacity from this consumer to respond to those resources, because they cannot be not provided in some sense. So there, I don't know how useful residential consumers could be currently, but definitely the grid interfacing buildings or larger buildings could be of much better use. Even EV charging stations could be used for those particular types of services. So there is definitely different time scales of operation. There are different types of program. What I want to give out as why demand response at the residential level is probably not working, and this is our conjecture, is the risk that the consumers are basically forced, the financial risk that they have because of participating in, let's say, a dynamic pricing kind of a policy. And this is this conjecture we are driving from the fact what happened recently, let's say in Texas, when there was this winter storm and a lot of consumers were participating in dynamic pricing kind of scenario, and they saw a very high price from their, of course, utility companies, right? So that how can we mitigate those kind of risks? Because residential consumer definitely don't want that, and that's kind of let's put it in this way, definitely something that I am putting there. I don't know whether they don't want it or want it. And our research cannot prove or disprove that as well. But let's say if the risk avoidance is one of the criteria for the consumers, then we need to design contracts in a way that do not expose these consumers to financial risk of variable generation or extreme weather events that are coming from the grid, and that for which these services are being extracted. So what we did was we designed these critical peak rebate contracts for which the consumers are paid upfront, and they are designed based on some analysis from the electricity authority as well as the consumer side. So they are optimal for both electricity authority as well as consumer. So they are paid upfront, which means the consumers are already taken care of, and whether they are those services are extracted, whether those contracts are actually activated or not, depend upon what kind of system conditions the energy authority ends up seeing. So that was kind of our solution for this peak demand response mitigation. I hope I answered your question without actually digressing too much, and I hope I was slow for enough in this virtual setup to answer that question, but I'll do my best in the rest of the session as well.
No, okay, that was great. Just one quick terminology clarifying question. I just want to make sure that that everyone is on the same page together with you. When you say price-based versus incentive-based, I think what you're referring to is pricing as embedded in like your underlying consumption price. So the, you know, seeing the price of actually using electricity going up and down, as in the case of a dynamic price, versus the incentive received through a program structure where you get paid on like an event basis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. So the way the FERC report actually does that is basically dynamic pricing and demand response, right? So the one is dynamic pricing based, retail participation, and other is demand response based retail participation. Those are two separations.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. I also have a clarifying question I wanted to pose to you, Alan. I noticed your observation that, or your finding that 20% of feeders were going to need upgrading. And I just want to understand what that means in the context of the whole system, or what you think it means in the context of the system. Because if 20% of them require upgrading and 80% of them don't require upgrading, then on the 80%, what is the impact on the 80%? Like, does that mean that there's improved asset utilization on the other 80%? And if so, is the net effect for this level of penetration, the 6 million, is the net effect a beneficial one or a non-beneficial one in your assessment?
Yeah, so 80% don't need upgrades yet. We weren't looking necessarily at the asset utilization question. We were just mainly focusing in on if any of the sort of voltage thresholds or capacity thresholds were being exceeded. It could very well be, that there are instances where you have like greater resiliency just coincidentally due to the shape of the charging profiles. But the main focus of what we're doing, we're looking at sort of upgrade costs. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't think I can provide like a great answer to that specific question based on what we were doing in this analysis.
Totally fine. Just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing where that was showing up. Thanks. Jim? I have a clarifying question for each person. So when you were presenting, you talked about combining system data with other types of data, which is actually something that's really been on my own mind a lot recently in a somewhat different context. And the data that are of interest to me are and I think you mentioned the DMV, for example, but I'm also wondering about other geographic features that are not necessarily grid features. A lot of my work pertains to the electrification, for example, of trucks and buses. So I take an interest in facilities that attract a lot of trucks, which, there's no particular reason why that would be reflected on a grid map. And I'm just wondering in terms of how you use the data and how you think about the data, how are you approaching combining grid data with basically anything that is not grid data? That is in the world.
Yeah, I guess there are a lot of things to unpack there. So to think about, just this is a related but different project where we're trying to do basic forecasting of just GHG in California. And one of the big challenges is vehicle miles traveled, especially when you start getting into the freight sector, as you've said. The research community is so addicted to smog check data because it gives you reasonably high frequency vehicle miles traveled number for any car that gets a emissions check, but that sort of excludes electric vehicles, which are becoming, the thing we really care about. And freight is not generally doing that same thing. And so one trying to get at that through other ways is becoming difficult. And so just think about that in terms of where say, in your own work, that sort of thing. There's just a bunch of geographic challenges in terms of trying to map distribution circuits to other sorts of I guess, geographic features and even just trying to map residences to circuits, which they're there, you know, the utilities know those things, but sometimes circuits themselves change. So they're not sort of immutably fixed all the time as well. And then just there are things that aren't really routinely collected, like distribution level losses that are important. There are several things that are really important but don't get talked about as much because the people who pay for them aren't really at the table very often. In this case, losses are sort of compensated through a very, you know, basically an automatic pass through from some kind of either wholesale or retail provider. And none of the people in the vertical supply chain are necessarily directly sort of responsible for losses or really rewarded for reducing them. And I think there is a lot of potential for doing that. And measuring them would be sort of first step. So the lack of data on that is sort of indicative of how none of the people who actually are in a position to measure it feel the need to. And so there's a relationship there between incentives and actually what we're looking at. That's a long answer, so we can continue.
That was a super answer.
Can I chime in?
Alan wanted to jump on that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just want people to understand the sort of pain here, because you're right. Like when, you know, we do a lot of electric vehicle work, and when we think about forecasting electric vehicle adoption, you know, at the census block or census tract or county level, we're not saying, you know, these vehicles are getting adopted at this feeder line, right? And so there's a huge mismatch, and that was a enormous problem for this project, and it's a difficult problem because you have to think about, oh, okay, these electric vehicles that we think are getting adopted here, how are we going to allocate them to specific lines? So that we had a very sort of complex way of going about this. It's a very sort of challenging process to align all these different sectors together that are used to, you know, really different mapping of resolutions and sort of spatial work.
Yeah, electricity geography is just completely different.
Wacko.
Yeah, and you know, I think demographic data is another sort of category where we collect when one wants to start answering questions about equity and distribution outcomes. All of that demographic data is collected at the census block level, and there isn't really an ability to know. You can sort of only kind of look for overlaps to try to know what circuit level kind of outcomes compare.
That is super, and I'm so glad that that direction was fruitful, because actually I didn't think about it before, but I think it dovetails with the clarification I was going to ask Michelle. So good, things are hanging together. Michelle, thank you for your great presentation. I noted a couple of things, but on the sort of subject of granularity of the data, I'm accustomed to operating primarily in a restructured state, and where I sit, I have heard over the years a lot about how these distribution level resources are basically invisible from the perspective of the transmission level grid operator, because they're kind of on a different scale, different systems. And so I was wondering, on the one hand, does that have its analog in a vertically integrated state such as yours, or do you actually see everything? And on a related note, you know, you showed an image of hosting capacity that I think you noted was less granular than what had been shown before, and you spoke about the possible need to move on to different systems that would provide greater granularity. And I was wondering if you could talk at all about kind of what kinds of system upgrades would be needed and how long those take. Because if in fact we need a very similar system, or very, very different system going forward to accomplish the kinds of things that one wants to accomplish, I understand that things like billing systems can be like a decade-long project for utilities to upgrade. So I'm kind of wondering whether we're talking about something of a similar duration, or whether there are more rapid opportunities that exist that you foresee.
Yeah, thank you. So I feel like I should start by saying, of course, we see all. So don't question us at the commission. No, I'm kidding. what is visible depends on the utility, and Minnesota has a lot of different utilities. And just within our investor-owned utilities, some of them only have visibility at their substations, others have visibility at their feeders, and then over time, we are starting to get better visibility within the feeders. Once the advanced meters roll out, they provide some options. So visibility depends. And I wouldn't say it takes necessarily a decade, but it does take time. And I think one thing that is important to think about is when I mentioned the foundations you have to build. So we started with one utility approving the advanced distribution management system, which is really a software platform for that utility. But you then had to build everything else on top of that. And they had to build out the infrastructure of like how they were going to share data, which used to be siloed in some places, are on different time scales, might be pretty messy. Like that all takes a while. So we've been working on grid modernization. We started in 2005 and then picked up again, I think, with like increased intensity in like the 2016 timeframe. And we're just like hosting capacity is something where one utility is doing it. And I think we're going on our 5th iteration of it. And each time it's its own docket where we're learning and asking for more information. So when it first came out, the utility was making an assumption based on its equipment rating of what its daytime minimum load was. It was just saying everywhere on our grid, 20% of the equipment rating is what the daytime minimum load is. We started to make them give us actual daytime minimum load, and then we learned how hard it is, even though they have that visibility, to clean that data up and figure out. And that took like about 2 years to get it on all of their feeders. And we're still evaluating, taking into effect the costs of that, like how much benefit, like how far off was that 20% assumption, and what does that mean for hosting capacity? So, so I think, did I address everything you were asking? But that's just one example of this. Oh, and the last thing was your first question about between the bulk system and the distribution grid. That is an area, I think it was mentioned FERC Order 2222 and the aggregation of DERs. Even without that order, but especially because of it, there is this need and discussion around making more visible what's happening on the distribution grid to the bulk power system for their planning. And so there is whole groups like NERC, the North American Reliability Corporation, has a system planning impacts of DER spider work group that's looking at these questions of modeling and visibility. There's groups like the Energy System Integration Group that is looking at how these things work together. So we're getting there. And I think what really helps is when the federal and state jurisdictions work together, kind of respecting boundaries and realizing, like any map, the closer you get to that line, the more kind of blurred it is. But it makes for fun stuff.
Thanks, that was super helpful. I want to be mindful both of the time and of the fact that there's actually a lot of great questions about data in the Q&A that we should get to. But I before we move on, I just something that I think applies to all the research presenters is so what types of data would be very, basically, do you wish the utilities were able to furnish to you that the utilities literally do not have, that, you know, that does not exist, even though if anyone had it, it would be the utility. I know that everyone's research would be benefited from better data, but there are both constraints on what you can actually get because it can't be given to you, but there's also constraints on what you can't get because it does not exist. And I was wondering if you could speak to that before we move on.
We'll take everything. Actually, one of the things that I think would be very useful for us is better load data for the distribution feeder level information. I think, you know, we may do with essentially what you might characterize as kind of peak data, peak loads on a monthly basis, and that can help us to characterize, you know, some of these excursion events, but having sort of more complete picture of that gives you a better sense of, you know, how often these things are occurring, and helps better to address questions of resiliency and things like that.
I already kind of answered with the losses question, and I'll just point out that, you know, a lot of the differentiation in pricing at the wholesale level that we see in all those colorful maps ISOs publish, that's losses. And so at the distribution level, there are potentially significant differences in the cost and the value of power that are largely driven by losses that are much more significant at the distribution level than anything we see at the wholesale level. And it's more than just of interest itself. It's a very strong signal into some of the other underlying aspects of these questions that we're talking about with distribution.
So I'll add to that, for the specific research on the demand response and the incentive design, the ask is big. It's basically on the consumer data, how they consume the electricity pattern, which is a very private information. But if there could be some synthetic ways to generate that data that we can take a look at, and there are ways to really do that, and maybe more, make some of that information available based on, let's say, customer class, maybe not individual level, but maybe based on the residential consumer class kind of information if we have, maybe just retracting all the private information and making some of this available. I think that will be crucial to do some of this consumer-centric study, or to understand how and what consumers' energy use patterns are and behaviors are. So right now, of course, there are good efforts going on. For example, with the Pecan Street data set that is available, which provides data for extensive set of households at one particular neighborhood. But making these available for several different geographic locations, several different consumer class feeders sections, I think that will make it a lot more useful to do this kind of study, because this data is something we cannot model. We don't know how to model humans. So this is something that we just cannot model.
I would give a quick plug for California. About maybe a decade ago, put in place a process for allowing researchers to access, household meter level data. And it's been a long process, but the different parties have sorted through the confidentiality, the data security questions, the how do you compensate staff at utilities who are doing the data pulls, and work through all that. And now there's it's not frictionless, but there's a really well-established process for researchers to gain access to data that that I think really should be something other jurisdictions could look at as incredibly valuable, because you're crowdsourcing a lot of the types of analyses that utilities would otherwise be forced to do themselves.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Especially the Pecan Street data are fascinating, but yeah, this many years out, I would hope that we would have access for more regions, more types of households, more about. To my knowledge, that doesn't include apartment a lot of different types of energy and a lot of different types of commercial applications to have good model information about that. We received a question about, because I do think it's time to move on to questions that are in the Q&A. We received a question about EVs. To what extent EV discharging in a V2G configuration could ameliorate capacity concerns at times when circuits are overloaded. And I guess it's posed as a question, I think, for you, Jim, but actually, in a way, I think that could be.
Yeah, it sounds like an Alan question to me,
but I actually think it could be a question for almost
anyone. I suppose it's a DR.
Insofar as, yeah, even Anamika, I don't know if you think about the residential demand response as potentially demand responding in the, or putting energy on the grid from a residential perspective. It
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily have to be from vehicles, but anyone who's able to take a question about building to grid type injections, to what extent do you see that as able to ameliorate the capacity concerns that you're cognizant of?
So I can add one line quickly since you mentioned my name. So EVs are definitely, to me, EVs are Uber for storage. This is how I see it. It's basically an amazing future of flexibility that they can unlock if we can make V2G seamless, and if we can actually make a battery cycle degradation concerns go away. So those kind of things still has to be, of course, considered to make residential or personal use vehicles to work for V2G. But to me, they are a resource of huge flexibility that can be basically plugged on in anywhere in the feeder to provide that local flexibility. Like we call Uber for going from one place to other, we can just call Uber for providing flexibility at this part of the grid to that part of the grid. Of course, that's a simplification of what we need to make that really happen. But to me, that looks like a huge resource that we will have at our end when vehicle electrification or transportation electrification actually happens at the pace it's going. That resource can be used a lot to do this real-time supply-demand imbalance by providing appropriate incentives, of course, for those resources. I'll just stop at that.
That's great, thanks. Jim Allen, do you have do you want to take this?
We probably both do, but yeah. So I'll throw on a couple points, and Alan can sort of agree or disagree. But the big issue you hear about is that the vehicle owners are very reluctant to do anything that might threaten the lifetime of the battery or the capacity of the battery. And I mean, we see this at the wholesale level. The CAISO has been disappointed with the participation of wholesale utility scale batteries who seem reluctant to actually do charge discharge. Not that they don't do it at all, but they're much more prefer to sort of sit at a preferred state of charge and provide ancillary services. And so the big, I think, thing to overcome is the extent it's real. There's a real cost to sort of doing an actual discharge into the grid. And that's why I think a lot of researchers focused more on this sort of deferral or management of the charging rather than the sort of charge discharge kind of full cycle that we normally associate with storage.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Jim. I think the behavioral elements of both smart charging and V2G are substantially more difficult than the sort of technical elements, which isn't to say that sort of technical elements is also a big challenge. I kind of want to sort of back out and say, give everyone a perspective though, at the end of the day, it is a huge potential. If we reach the governor's target of 5 million vehicles, EVs on the road by 2030, you're talking about, okay, let's say an average of 50 kilowatt hours per EV. You are now on the order of about 250 gigawatt hours of storage, right? You're talking about 8 hours storage for the entire state of California, just in vehicles. So, that's an enormous economic potential. I think someone is going to capture some of that value in some way because it's there, right? And there are lots of fundamental difficulties in how we might realize that and how you might convince consumers to participate in something like that. But there is, I think, a real value there to be captured.
So yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of potential there. And I guess, Michelle, from your perspective, to be able to have these vehicle to grid types of services offered and other kinds of building to grid services, what do you need from a policy standpoint, either in terms of data or other support that makes that possible to do at scale from a policy standpoint?
If I knew that answer, I would. I think what I would offer here is what we're seeing when we look at how we could avoid distribution upgrades using DERs. one of the challenges we're seeing is like with the electric vehicles, and I think Anamika was talking about firm capacity, like to be able to rely on it. Like you don't know which vehicles are going to be where exactly when you need it. And so if it's a location specific issue, something like storage might be better. And there you see, at least in Minnesota, the costs are not yet there for that to be a real solution. But part of that is also how we value these things. And people talk about value stacking, and we're trying to work out like value stacking requires some flexibility, which means it's less firm for the purpose that the utility wants to rely on it. And so where's the right balance of opening up the flexibility to find that value while still being able to trust it's going to be there when you need it. So those are the kinds of things we're thinking about.
So I think that may dovetail with something I had meant to ask Alan, and others may also have thoughts on this, which is how real world feeder circuit data might be able to be leveraged to help bring down the grid impacts of this new charging load and other usage that's that may have locationally specific impact.
Yeah, I think having access to that sort of data just gives you a better sense of the coupling between, you know, the load demands that you're seeing on that infrastructure and the load that you're going to see coming in from the electric vehicles. And so that's just going to give you a sort of better sense of what's needed for a particular, you know, circuit or you know, for at a substation when you can expect these things to start becoming problematic. And actually, one of the interesting things that I might sort of tag on to what Michelle was saying about the sort of firm capacity and flexibility, you know, when we think about the early days of you know, utilities or regulatory agencies trying to think about this issue and manage this, let's say, electric vehicle load coming onto the grid, it can be difficult at sort of low volumes because, you know, if I'm an electric vehicle owner, I go in, maybe I charge every 2 or 3 days, 3 or 4 days. It can be sort of very stochastic, right? And so when you're dealing with 10 or 100 vehicles, that the load shapes are highly variable. But once you are getting to large volumes, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of vehicles, you still have variability, inherent variability sort of hour to hour, but the overall aggregate shape of that charging load becomes much more clear. And that gives you a sort of better grasp of being able to understand what that load looks like and how you might take advantage of, you know, the greater flexibility provided by the fact that there's just so much to work with, essentially. Yeah, and so I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much. I guess we're nearing the end, but there's a great question in the Q&A that I want to make sure we get in there, which is where you think the greatest opportunity exists to improve energy equity while doing it through distribution planning. What's the missing link and the research that would be needed to use data or to improve equity by actually looking at the system?
Well, okay, I'll just say, I think it starts with rates and we can look at, and I think there has been some research starting to look at, you know, reliability outcomes from different levels. It's a really tough question because, you know, you've got both reliability outcomes, and you also have sort of the cost of an outage may not be the same for everybody as well. And so I think that's a very hard thing to try to sort through, but we could try. But I do think it starts with, you know, trying to think about exactly how rates interact with the access to all of these things we have been talking about, solar, electric vehicles, and all the other things. And in some cases, they're a barrier, and in some cases, they're maybe not enough of a barrier. And all those things affect different households differently. And you can layer on different types of like means tested supports. So just one of the things that my colleagues and I have talked about a lot is sort of some kind of means tested grid connection fee that would allow for a lot of the fixed grid costs to be pushed off of the kilowatt hour charge and onto the connection sort of aspect of that. And that there's been resistance to those types of things because of concerns over them being regressive. But I think those connection charges themselves can be means tested and as a way to try to compensate for that.
And I would just add that in Minnesota, one thing we're doing is looking at locational reliability data from an equity standpoint, as well as we've been asked to look at things like energy affordability and like participation in energy assistance programs and energy efficiency programs to start to sort of map where are there gaps in those things.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, but it's a very difficult one, because fundamentally, right, you're talking about, okay, if I need to upgrade this infrastructure, because people are using more EVs, right, and that causes your sort of rates across the network to go up, right? You've got a bunch of people subsidizing, these EV drivers, and so I think some of these, it's very difficult to talk about pricing these rates at a neighborhood level, right? Like this guy down the street is going to be seeing a really different rate from, someone just across, to a different, feeder network. But I think some of these ideas about, maybe doing that as a connection fee or having that as a rebate, I think these are ways that you can start to address those issues. But I think, the way that at least I would think you would want to do it, at this sort of really granular neighborhood level. I don't think that's necessarily possible with the way that we do rate structures right now.
Yeah, have the same sense. Anand, did you have anything to add? I want to make sure you have a chance before I start to close out.
No, I mean, I just had one thought that I wanted to share. Basically, we are kind of we're kind of making the equity question go worse with the current policies, is how I feel about it. For example, those who are getting the solar connections, they are, or EV connections, right? They're kind of causing utilities to go for system upgrades, and they are being subsidized right now. So, and of course that's probably needed because we want to encourage this kind of behavior, right? But then that raises the social equity questions altogether, and that requires us to shift our policies that can probably have this circular effect of people not adopting these technologies. So in my mind, it's a very hard question to answer. And how do we really balance this adoption versus the creating this kind of social equity for other people subsidizing for that behavior? So I don't have a solution. I just had a thought that I wanted to share.
I appreciate that. That's really important. Thank you for sharing that. So thank you to everyone for your fantastic presentations and engaging in this conversation, which I found really fascinating. I hope other people did as well. And thanks again, Bea. I'm going to hand the mic back to you to close out.
All right, well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to all the panelists for such a riveting conversation. We will be posting the recording of this discussion on EDS webpage within a week or so, as well as the PowerPoint presentations of the panelists. I'll also be writing up a blog summarizing this webinar shortly afterwards, so keep your eye out for that. And finally, I just want to mention that we have one more webinar coming up, final in the series, on distributed energy resource valuation and compensation, and that will be in late April. So stay tuned, and we'll be advertising for that shortly. So thank you everyone again, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.